Welcome to the COA. This is being given under the rubric of Share Your Story. So you're going to hear a little bit about me and a little bit about Taiwan. My name is Stephen Maire. I tripped my way into Chinese studies, wound up in Taiwan, actually enjoyed it, came back to the US, tried to work for in the US for a year, got bored, managed to convince my wife, not my wife then, but managed to convince her that we should go back overseas. And I said, it'd only be 3 to 5 years. 20 years later, she said, I think we've been here long enough. And so we gradually transitioned back to the US. But even since then, I've been traveling back and forth, keeping United Airlines very, very happy. So this is obviously a really interesting time to be talking about Taiwan. Xi Jinping, in the midst of a Taiwanese election for president, kicked it off by saying, China will surely be reunified, and all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits should be bound by a common sense of purpose and share in the glory of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The Taiwanese responded by re-electing a Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, candidate president, and the DPP's official position is Taiwan should be independent. So despite the China threats, the Taiwanese people went the other way. What makes all the saber rattling in the Straits interesting is that the DPP already holds the presidency of China, so there's no great political change. The candidate who won, Lai, has said he's not going to change anything from the previous president. And so we're asked the question of, so what's different from the PRC's point of view or Taiwan's point of view? So we can look at it and say, okay, how did we get here? What happened? What got us here? So we're going to begin October 31st, 1977. This was when I arrived in Taipei, a know-it-all, smart guy of 22 who was completely clueless because I arrived on a national holiday, Chiang Kai-shek's birthday, as it turned out. In 1977, this was a new holiday. It had only been instituted in 1975, when Chiang Kai-shek had died, and it was going to be removed as a holiday in 2007. The institution of the holiday, the removal of the holiday, all speak to an ongoing tension in Taiwan between the mainlanders, who came over in '49, and the Taiwanese, who were there, let's say, originally. But before we jump into things too much, what we're going to do is go over some basic facts and figures, some history, a little more on why I was in Taiwan, Taiwan's evolution to democracy, and then the question that probably has most of you interested in this, why Taiwan matters. My thesis is that through its history, Taiwan has been viewed of value to others for their own purposes. They have assigned a strategic value to Taiwan, an economic value, or an ideological value to Taiwan, and little consideration has ever been given to what the Taiwanese themselves thought about Taiwan or their future. So Taiwan in Asia, little island off the coast of a big Asia. Seems almost inconsequential. 4 major cities, Taipei in the north, Taichung in the middle, Tainan in the south, and Kaohsiung. Notice, everything's on the west coast. This is not because of proximity to China. Everything's on the west coast because running down the middle of the island is a chain of mountains that rise to over 12,000 feet. This is a serious mountain chain. Population, about 23 million, a little bit bigger than Florida. Land area, 14,000 square miles, a little bit bigger than Maryland, or slightly smaller than Switzerland. But it's in GDP per capita where Taiwan sets itself apart. 32,000 per capita GDP, 35th in the world. The US is about 2x, a little bit over 2 times Taiwan's number, 2.5 times Taiwan at 7th. Japan, only slightly greater than Taiwan. And Taiwan's about 2.5 times what mainland China's GDP is. Taiwan was one of the 4 dragons. South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan all came to the economic fore in the 70s and 80s using an export-led growth model. Now, back to our story. Why was I in Taiwan? I went to Middlebury College, and it had this quaint way of enrolling for courses where you walked into a gymnasium. This is before everything was online. And they said, okay, you can go in, but you can't leave until you've turned in 4 IBM punch cards that are your courses for the next semester. And this is really good if all the courses you want are available, but if the courses you want aren't available, they filled up, and you don't know that until you go ask for a card, then you have to figure out what to do. So I had some backup courses, and I thought, okay, Chinese history. Professor for Chinese history was a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Clifford, who was a brilliant professor, and he had me hooked from about the first lecture. In my senior year, Middlebury wanted to start a winter term Chinese language program. They needed some people to attend a second year term, and they said, why don't you come to summer school in Vermont, study Chinese, we'll make it worth your while, and that way we could justify hiring this professor and his assistant. And I said, that's a good idea, but I need to work over the summer to get some money. And they said, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. And take care of it they did. Tuition was free, got a job in the fall on campus, everything worked out really well. As graduation approached, and I was getting pretty deep into Chinese studies, my father said at one point, he said, before you get into this too far, you really ought to go to Asia and see if you like what this is all about. And I thought, well, this was pretty good. Now, I was a child of the 60s and 70s, and my idea of Chinese food at the time was la choy. It's not the greatest example of Chinese food. In fact, I'd only ever had, by the time I graduated from college, one Chinese meal, which was a going-away lunch from an internship in DC at a China-related business organization. So I knew next to nothing about Chinese food. I also didn't really have any money. After I bought the airplane ticket, I had about $400, and that was it. And so this wasn't completely atypical. So my plan was, okay, buy a one-way ticket, go to Taiwan, get a job. Worst comes to worst, I teach English. Should be okay. Save enough money, should be able to get back if I have to. And so that was the plan. Hop on a plane, go to Taiwan, be completely clueless, wake up on a national holiday that you don't know is happening, and then figure out how to get a job. And that was what I did. This began the start of a lot of learning about Taiwan. And you discover that Taiwan's history is complicated. So you've got a handout that has a glossary of terms. It's also a reading list to let you explore at your leisure Taiwan history. I'm going to try not to say China, because that often confuses things. When referencing the mainland, I'm going to say PRC, People's Republic of China. and Taiwan will be Taiwan or the ROC, Republic of China, depending on the period. That way, I hope to keep the confusion at a minimum. So first up, 1542, the Portuguese sailed by, didn't stop, and they said, what a beautiful place. We're going to call it Formosa. There were, of course, already people here. There were an Aboriginal people whose origins were Malaysia and the Philippines, and there were already some Chinese who had moved from the mainland to Taiwan. In context, the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts in 1620, 80 years later. 1624, the Dutch sailed by, and they said, okay, we're going to set up a fort. We're going to use it to trade with the mainland. 1626, 2 years later, the Spanish dropped in. They went to the north and said, we're going to use it to trade. 1642, the Dutch got tired of the Spanish being there, kicked the Spanish out. Then, in 1661, a Chinese name finally appears on the scene, Koxinga, or Zheng Chenggong. And he comes over to Taiwan in 1661, and he defeats the Dutch after a siege at their fort in the middle of Taiwan. 1668, he defeats the Dutch in the north, and the Dutch are now gone from Taiwan. Taiwan is now under Koxinga's domain. So the question is, why is Koxinga in Taiwan? And the answer to this, or for the answer to this, we have to go back to 1644. 1644 is what historians regard as the end of the Ming Dynasty and the beginning of the Qing Dynasty. So Ming Dynasty collapses, Qing Dynasty takes over. Except that the Qing were not Chinese. The Qing were Manchus. And in Chinese history, they are referred to as a conquest dynasty because they came in and conquered China for the Manchus. They swept in the power vacuum and the chaos by the fall of the Ming. And in fact, Ming, as you maybe know, had built the Great Wall, which was intended to keep people like the Manchus out. And it did an okay job, not great, but okay. But it becomes completely self-defeating when your Ming general decides that the Manchus are actually a better alternative than the rebels who are currently sacking Beijing. And he opens the doors and says to the Manchus, come on in, boys, it's all yours. So the Manchus were let into China by a Ming general. The Manchus maintained throughout their rule in China the Manchu language in government documents, and more to the point, they required all Chinese men to wear their hair in a ponytail. The queue, the ponytail that we see in Chinese art from the 1800s or so, is a sign of submission of the Chinese to the Manchus. But Koxinga was a Ming loyalist. He was a defender of the Ming. And his plan was to use Taiwan as a basis to defend the Ming dynasty and actually expel the Qing, or the Manchus. Didn't work. 1683, the Manchus defeat the Ming loyalists and take control of the island. And what you see up here, north of Korea, this is the traditional Manchu homeland. By 1644, they had expanded the Manchu Empire to this block of terrain. And then in 1644, with the fall of the Ming, they proceed to take over what is the old Ming Empire. And this area here is the limit of the Ming. The Manchus then proceed over the next 300 years to expand China by conquering Tibet and Xinjiang or East Turkestan and Mongolia. So the Manchus were an expansionist dynasty. They enlarged China considerably from the Ming. On Taiwan, they had a problem. The Aboriginal peoples controlled the mountains, and the only area that the Qing decided to take on was the coastal area. Oops. So the Qing controlled this coastal plain. The mountainous area remained ungoverned under the Qing. And then as we saw, Taiwan was not only conquered, but much of the western area was conquered. In 1895, the Qing, or China, at this point in time, goes to war with Japan, and the Manchu Chinese forces lose, and Japan takes over Taiwan for 50 years. From 1895 until the end of the Second World War, Taiwan is a Japanese colony. During World War II, Chiang Kai-shek says to Roosevelt, and Chiang Kai-shek and China were a US ally, he says, "I want Taiwan back." Roosevelt is an anti-colonialist, and he says, "You've got it." So in 1945, at the end of the war, the ROC, Republic of China, takes over Taiwan. Now, if you read some of the literature, you'll see discussions about whether this should have gone this way or not, but I don't think it was going to go any other way. The ROC and Taiwan had problems from the start. The first one was language. Taiwanese had been 50 years educated by Japanese, who naturally taught them to speak Japanese. The mainlanders who came over to take control of Taiwan spoke Mandarin. The Taiwanese did speak a local language, local dialect, called Minnan or Hokkien, different places, but clearly there's a lot of communication issues. Moreover, the ROC government was incredibly corrupt. Inflation was rampant, and the Taiwan economic conditions started to deteriorate quickly. All of this came to a head on 2/28/47 when some tobacco monopoly officers started to hassle a woman who was selling a few cigarettes on the street about breaching the monopoly. This exploded into riots. The riots were interpreted by the ROC as insurrection, and the ROC, or KMT, Kuomintang response, Nationalist Party response, was to come in and initiate both martial law and a white terror that saw large parts of the Taiwanese intelligentsia and upper class removed, imprisoned, or executed. Now, when I get to Taiwan in the late 1970s, Taiwan is free China. Right? This is what we'd all heard, what we'd all been told. It was a bastion of democracy in Asia, defending itself against communism. This was a view promoted by the China lobby. They had been very successful in this view, and most of us probably thought that's the way it was, except that it wasn't really true. Martial law was still in effect. There was censorship of the press and the media, and the conflict between the mainlanders and the Taiwanese was still evident. Most of this was revealed through the Taiwanese or Minnan language, where Taiwanese would speak Minnanu or Taiwanese in front of mainlanders just to irritate them. Speak this language they couldn't understand just to irritate them. The government was still trying to Sinicize the Taiwanese population. This is from a building outside of Taipei, but in the countryside. And the characters say, please speak Mandarin. The government is still trying to promote Mandarin language usage as a way to sinicize the population. It didn't take very long to figure all this out. But that also left us with a bit of a problem, because the word among the Americans studying in Taiwan at the time, and those were most of the Americans in Taiwan, was that mail was opened and censored, or simply never made it to its destination. So after you got to Taiwan and you saw this was a situation, you wanted to write the letter home that said, hey, the reality is very different from what we've been told. But you're worried about that letter being caught, your visa being canceled, and a few other goodies. So you either gave that letter to a friend who was doing a visa renewal run to Hong Kong, and he posted it from Hong Kong, or you went on your own visa renewal run and posted it. But by 77, change was in the air. Despite martial law and the terror, the KMT, the Nationalist Party that ran the ROC, Republic of China, was actually committed to doing a better job on Taiwan than it had done on the mainland. Clearly, there's an element of self-interest here. When you've retreated as far as you can and there's no place left to retreat to, you better make certain that that last retreat holds out. And while the KMT was not willing to give grounds on politics, it did on economics, and it created the foundation for Taiwan's economic growth. 71, 72, the rules of the game changed again. The PRC was admitted to the UN. The US now recognizes the PRC. Taiwan's left in the lurch, and the KMT now has a problem. Here you are, a government claiming to represent all of China, and your biggest funder has decided, no, you don't really govern all of China and never will. The actual guy governing China is your arch enemy, the Communist Party and the PRC. And of course, everyone in Taiwan is sitting there saying, well, if you're no longer recognized as the government of China, what are you doing governing us as well? And in 1972, the Shanghai Communique is released, and it says, all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of that China. This was as false then as it is now. Not all Chinese. The KMT, the ROC government believed it. The people of Taiwan did not. Interesting to see how Xi Jinping's last words and the Shanghai Communique sort of echo each other. The roots of this difference in view lie in demographics. The ethnic makeup of Taiwan. 87, 88% are Taiwanese. Chinese, they're called Bendi, people of this place. People who have been born and raised in Taiwan for generations, mostly from Fujian province across the way, but not entirely. There are other Chinese groups there. Another 2 to 3% are the Aborigines, the original people. They're referred to as Yuandi, original people. And the final 10% are mainlanders and sons and daughters of mainlanders who came over roughly in the post-World War II period till 49. And they're referred to in Chinese as Wai Sheng Ren, born outside. Okay? Not born in Taiwan, born over there someplace. And if you look at surveys, and this covers the period 92 to 2022, and we look in particular at this green line. This is the number of Chinese, or number of Taiwanese, who are identifying as Taiwanese. We are Taiwanese. We are our own people. The number who identify as Chinese are this blue line, and it starts at around 25%, and then it goes down to almost nothing. So very, very few people in Taiwan now identify as just Chinese. There's another large group, this pink line, who identify as both Taiwanese and Chinese, but even that is trending down. And part of this is simply because where the mainland have gone and where Taiwan has gone have been two completely different places. And we're going to see examples of that shortly. In fact, even the CCP is conflicted on the idea of what Taiwan is. Here's Mao in 1936. He's talking to Edgar Rice Snow, who was later to write Red Star Over China, one of the most famous books about the Communist Party. And Mao's saying, after we get ourselves free, get the British imperialists and so on out, then if the Koreans want help throwing the Japanese out, we'll help them. And we're not going to try to take over Korea. And oh, by the way, this also applies to Taiwan. If Taiwan wants to throw out the Japanese, we'll help them too, and presumably not take them over. Now, obviously, this being said in 1936, little did Mao know that a year later, full-blown war would break out between Japan and China, and that 4 years later, the US would be dragged into the war by Japan, and that the destruction of Japan would be so complete that both Korea and Taiwan became available. The view would also change, of course, when your most hated arch-rival political group retreats to Taiwan and says, this is our hangout, it's us. You're going to say you want to finish the business of taking over China, and that means taking over Taiwan. By 1975, Chiang Kai-shek dies. His son, Jiang Jingguo, takes over the government. By 1977, you have this ongoing tension between democracy and authoritarianism. There's voting, and my arrival in Taiwan was initiated by a local election. And in a town called Zhongli, just south of Taipei, people were watching the vote counting from outside the police station where it was being conducted, and they noticed that the ballot boxes were being stuffed in favor of KMT candidates, and they responded by burning down the police station. A year later, Taiwan reaches an inflection point. A magazine starts up called Meili Dao, Beautiful Taiwan. And although it's a magazine, it establishes a bunch of offices in different Taiwan cities, and it really starts behaving like an anti-KMT political party. The magazine is anti-KMT. They're hosting activities that are anti-government, and they decide on December 10, they're going to have a demonstration in honor of the UN International Declaration of Human Rights, which to celebrate that event. And so they're going to stage this demonstration in Kaohsiung, a city in the south. Now, the government knows that this is going to happen. The opposition is quite clear about what it's going to do. And we have all the makings here for a Taiwanese version of Tiananmen. Quash it, political opposition's gone. Let it go through, the KMT is potentially undermined. Jiang Jingguo doubles down on democracy. The demonstration occurs, the police do break it up, but the police are unarmed, riot shields only. Arrests are made. The trials, which under martial law, which is what we're under, should be held in a military court, are instead held in public. The offenses under Taiwan law generally went as far as the death sentence, but no death sentences were issued, although there were prison sentences. And literally every major opposition figure who will figure in for the next 20 years in Taiwanese history is a part of this event, either as an organizer or as legal defense for those arrested. The Mei Li Dao offices around the island are all closed, and the party is generally wiped out. Except that 5 days later, December 15, Carter announces full recognition of the PRC and de-recognizes the Republic of China. And as much as this undermines the KMT position in Taiwan, it also threatens the Taiwanese. So now there is, to a certain degree, common cause between the Taiwanese and the mainlanders. In '86, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, formally forms and legally forms as a party. '87, martial law is lifted. '88, Jiang Jingguo dies, and Li Tenghui is made president. Now, Li Tenghui is a native Taiwanese. He is not a mainlander, graduate of Cornell's PhD program in economics. And he's distrusted by the KMT hardliners. They think he's too much of a Taiwanese. He's too sympathetic to what the Taiwanese is. They were probably right to distrust him. First thing he did was named a cabinet that included a majority of Taiwanese-born members. And then in 1990, there was a student demonstration called the Wild Lily Movement, and this resulted in a negotiated settlement of how Taiwan would approach democracy. And then, probably insult of insults, in 1995, Li Tenghui declared 2/28, the day of the riots and the crackdown and the start of the White Terror, declared that a national holiday of peace and remembrance. When I arrived in Taiwan, you heard little undercurrents of 2/28, 2/28. No one knew what it was. It had not been researched in American books. It was not written about. No one talked about it. But in the minds of all Taiwanese, it was there. This was the original sin of the KMT. And then in 1996, Taiwan has its first direct presidential election, and Li Tenghui wins. 4 years later, the DPP won its first election. Since then, Taiwan has gone on to develop its own version of democracy, and among legislators, this required a rather unique skill set. Practically from the beginning, fighting it out in the Legislative Assembly was the way to go. It's a spirited democracy. 2016, I went back to Taiwan for a business trip. I had been back in 1992, but there weren't really a lot of changes by '92. So 2016, I went back and I left some time on the trip to try to catch up and see what had happened to Taipei. I'd heard a lot. We knew people when we lived in Hong Kong who worked on the Hong Kong subway system. At one point, they'd all moved to Taiwan and they were working on Taiwan's mass transit system. And I'd heard, things have changed, you should hang around. So I did. I stayed for a couple of days. And one place I wanted to go was a bookstore called Wellesley. I love bookstores. Wellesley had become a cultural icon. It had been written up in the Times and the Journal, I think. It was open 24 hours. People would go and camp out and read books, not buy them, just read them. So I walked into Wellesley, walked over to the magazine section, and there's a copy of Playboy magazine on display. I'm sitting there thinking, wow, things have really changed. If you were caught going through immigration in '77 with a copy of Playboy magazine, all of your belongings were going to be picked over with a fine-tooth comb. The only copies circulating before this were from US servicemen. who would sell them on the black market. And I thought, well, this is cool. I got to get down to Ximending, Westgate District, which was the old entertainment district. So this is Westgate in 1977 or 78. It is the heart of the movie theater district. All the movie theaters are down there. And in 1977, popular movies were playing. It was also home to the best fried dumpling shops in Taipei, which was a great reason for going there. Go back in 2016, and this is one side of the street. 1977, if you even owned a PRC flag, and that's what the red flags with the stars are, if you even owned one, you were going to go away for a long, long time. If you were foolish enough to own one and actually fly it, you were going to go away for an even longer time. The Chinese here on the left says, all of us on both coasts want to build a common China dream. And on the right, it says, I am a Taiwanese, but I am also a Chinese. It's worthwhile noting that most of the demonstrators in this crowd were older. They were older mainlanders. And as you can see from the two young women walking by, they're largely nonplussed. 200 yards away is the Central Taipei Police Station. There's a bunch of policemen you can't see out of the frame hanging out, chatting. They're not too worried about the demonstration. Across the street is another demonstration. This one says, Taiwan independent. And again, if you'd flown this banner in 1977, you were going away for a long time as well. So this ongoing tension of the relationship of Taiwan to China and what to do about it continues. The larger change in 2016 was a building called Taipei 101. And I'd heard that it had been built and had been open, but I didn't realize at the time how much of a change it had made. When I arrived in Taiwan in 1977, I lived in the southeast part of the city, and in part, I lived there because this is where the universities were and where the language programs were, and then you had a lot of younger American students, and they were renting rooms from Taiwanese families, so you could get a room rent instead of an apartment rent. And at the time, I was on the edge of the urban area. Not too far from where I lived was this really nice old-style Chinese house that was slated for demolition. Beautiful classic Chinese architecture. And it was well and truly at the end of the sidewalk. The view today is very different. And when you look from Taipei 101 down in the same direction, you see the city has just expanded and grown. In 2016, my feeling was the city had grown by about 50%. The population had grown by only a small fraction. Suddenly, the city was uncongested, easy to move around. And I thought, if this is the future of Chinese cities, I'm all in. Really nice. Now, Taipei 101 was completed in 2003. Didn't get a chance to get out there. And this is Taipei 101, the tall building in the background there. And these are the after-work crowds heading home. It's a corporate center, but the city government has also moved out there, and that creates a separation between the national government in one location and the city government in another. The dynamism of the Taiwanese economy is reflected in Taipei 101 and its surrounding area, a sign of the economic strength. But it plays out in the city in affecting all of the city's life. So the city is now a mixture of the old and the new. This is Saturday or Sunday afternoon in a shopping plaza. We've got the street musicians out collecting money. There were handicraft vendors out. This is the old Longshan Temple, one of the most remarkable temples in Taipei. This is a parent-child center with stroller parking, remarkably organized. This is a foot massage walk. The stones are all rounded, and you walk down it, and it will, in theory, massage your feet. This woman's doing pretty well. Looks like she's about 50 or 60 feet into it. I lasted about 20 feet and had to get out of there really quick. And this is the reason you all want to go to Taiwan. Here's your Chinese food. And this is the Taipei skyline, actually from the north of the city. So the city is hiding behind this ridgeline. And this yellow roof here is the Grand Hotel, which was built in the 60s or 70s. And it was a VIP location and sort of marked the middle of the city in the old days. And this is Taipei 101 back here. This is a new northern suburb that has filled in. And all these hills around Taipei make for great walking and hiking when you have some time off. But some things don't change. This is outside of Taipei 101 on what I thought was a pretty usual day. The green and red flag are from a group arguing that they are the Republic of Taiwan. And they say on their sign, the ROC, the Republic of China, is not Taiwan. And then it goes further to say, Taiwan has de jure independence. We are already independent. The sign holder in the back on the right with the white sign and the green shawl thing is holding a sign that accuses the KMT of being corrupt. Why does Taiwan matter? What do you think? Tech? I'm going to make a kind of contrarian argument here. And if we say Taiwan matters just because of the tech, we're really not a whole lot different from the Dutch or the Spanish or Coxinga saying we care about Taiwan for some strategic reason. We need to understand, how does a company like TSMC or Honhai become what it is? And it's because of the people who run it and the people who work for it. To me, this is Taiwan. And this is why it matters, because there are people who are living their lives, working hard just as we are, and trying to do well by their families. Since the emergence of democracy in 1995, Taiwan has moved past the colonial legacy of Dutch, Spanish, Ming, Manchu, and Japanese, and KMT. It's created its own society and its own culture. Bubble tea, which you may have heard of, Taiwanese invention. And it's a democracy. It's one of the rare examples of a state that has evolved to a democracy successfully. You can almost count those on one hand, I think. But its own success creates its own risk. Taiwan's threat to the PRC and the CCP is threefold. First, it is a democracy. And being a democracy, it says you don't have to be the authoritarian CCP government to be successful. Obviously, the CCP doesn't like this idea. Second, the CCP argues that only it can lead China to its rejuvenation and success in the world. Clearly, Taiwan has had considerable success, and the fact that Taiwan is successful says, no, maybe you don't need the CCP to be successful. And third, Taiwan's a geographically small place. The population of Taiwan at 23 million barely meets the population of the first tier cities in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or Shenzhen. And if you believe, like the PRC, that you are a great state and you're entitled to respect as a great state, the idea that Taiwan is sitting there saying, nah, we're not buying that argument. We'd rather do our own thing, thank you very much, just leave us alone, this offends the PRC. And we should be clear that the threat to Taiwan doesn't come from Taiwan. The old dream of let's go recapture the mainland, that's gone. The threat comes from the PRC. The PRC says Taiwan is Chinese. And culturally, this is certainly true. Share the same language, their culinary traditions, many of the same holiday traditions. Now, the analogy is imperfect, but up until 1776, we, living in the Americas, believed we were English. And in 1776, we decided, no, we're not, we're Americans. And to some degree, the Taiwanese have come to the same view. It's tempting to see the challenge to Taiwan is a responsibility of Taiwan to steer a course between its own political economic life, not antagonizing the PRC. I think this lets the PRC off the hook too easily. That the PRC has to be responsible for maintaining peace. Ensuring peace in the region, though, is going to fall to the US, Europe, and Japan to basically constrain the efforts of the PRC. In the meantime, I'm an optimist. This past spring, when we were in Taiwan for several weeks, we asked people about the saber rattling on the mainland, and the most common reply we got was they weren't worried. They were too busy getting on with life, work, kids, and family. They feel confident in Taiwan. In the meantime, I look forward to going back to Taiwan again, and I do hope you have a chance to visit as well. Are there any questions? Yes?
I'm curious about Hong Kong.
It's loosened up after the events of 2019 and 2020 when the PRC put in the anti-sedition security legislation. It is difficult because the Taiwanese are still worried that those who come may be essentially spies, basically. And the PRC's effort on what they call United Front work, where they seek to establish and undermine organizations to promote a PRC point of view, gives caution to Taiwan in that area. But they have accepted many of those who have fled from Taiwan. Yes?
How difficult would it be for the PRC to take over Taiwan over a period of time? I mean, militarily, it wouldn't be that hard.
I guess, to me, the question is, what do you want to take over? Do you want TSMC intact? Do you want the workforce intact? For that, it seems to me you need a peaceful unification. But increasingly, I think what we see from the PRC is what we would think of as the natural thing for a government to do is not exactly the way the PRC is thinking. The CCP is thinking differently. And so if the PRC moves on Taiwan, it is not in order to preserve its economy. It is simply to gain control of it and answer the ideological question of control of Taiwan. Yes? Lucky you.
So what other question I have is, why does China
who is so large and has their own problems, want this small island. You know, I mean, those two things kind of bother me. It seems to me,
Okay,
you
and
know,
in answer to the first question,
yeah.
why weren't there two Chinas in 1971? There weren't two Chinas in 1971 because Chiang Kai-shek was still running Taiwan. And the KMT view was there is one China, and we, the KMT, the ROC, are the governor of that. At that time in 1971, neither the CCP nor the KMT believed you could have two Chinas. They believed
Question of labeling.
it's a question of labeling, yes. Okay. The second question comes to a question of how the CCP justifies its governance of the mainland. And a large element of that is where the CCP says, we have asserted our inherent Chinese rights as a nation. We have rid ourselves of the British, the Americans, the French, the Japanese. And the last piece of business we have to do is to rid ourselves of these separatists on Taiwan, at which point we will have completed the mission that you put us into power to complete. Does anyone care about 23 million people in Taiwan? Actually, a lot of Chinese from the mainland used to go to Taiwan for holiday, and they really liked it. That answer the questions? Sometimes it,
But it could be like, you know, the French giving up Belgium.
yeah, well, you went through a major, 1960s, 1959, 1960, we were creating, it seemed, a new country every week, right? As the African colonies were securing their independence. China looks back at what they call the century of humiliation beginning in 1841, where they say the Western incursions, the taking of Hong Kong, Macau, the opening of the treaty ports was all humiliating for China, and the one task of the CCP is to remedy that humiliation. Returning Taiwan to the fold is the final step in that task. Yes?
How does Russia feel about Taiwan?
I don't think Russia thinks too much about Taiwan. They were trading a lot with Taiwan a long time ago, but at the moment, I think Russia has other problems. Yes?
I just have a comment. The pictures were,
That continues.
that continues. I just think it's interesting.
Senator from Massachusetts, Sumter, was nearly paralyzed when he was caned in an abolition debate. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah, no, it may take a while to work through this phase. Yeah. Yes.
How did Taiwan?
I like to think it's a product of several things. And I could see all of those when I started working in Taiwan. Taiwanese were willing to work. They were well educated. And they started from the ground up. They just worked at it and worked at it and worked at it. I was in the shoe business at the time, and I watched us go from making really simple, dumb shoes sold at Zare to making high-heeled shoes that required a lot more sophisticated technique. The manufacturers worked at it. I remember we lived in Hong Kong, and a shoe company in Taiwan called Baocheng had opened a factory in the mainland and was going to list publicly in Hong Kong. And they were making for Nike and Adidas. And I thought, this was the first company I had inspected. And when I had seen them making shoes, it was little slippers with an acrylic weave on the top that were being sold to Zare and were marked at 99 cents for sale. They just worked it consistently, ongoing, just kept working at it to develop the techniques. Taiwanese have also been open to the idea of coming to the US for graduate school and then going back. And so many have returned. That has brought expertise. Anything else? Has there ever been a Hollywood movie on Taiwan? I can't think of anything, but Taiwan didn't really figure in, let's say, the US psyche until 49, when the nationalists fled the mainland. And the US view at that time was, we're happy to let it go. The only reason Taiwan sort of existed was because North Korea invaded South Korea, and Truman didn't want the war to expand beyond Korea. You see a lot of movies that have a China mainland focus, PRC focus, because the PRC movie market is much bigger than the Taiwan movie market, on the one hand. And the PRC movie making companies were prepared to co-invest in productions with US filmmakers. So for US filmmakers, working with a Taiwan film company didn't really offer anything. You accessed an additional 23 million people maybe. Whereas working with a PRC company, you suddenly accessed 1.3 billion. And so that made them a lot more willing to work with PRC companies. Movies are getting expensive. You needed to make money at it, yeah. Yes?
One quick question. When did the name change from Formosa to?
In some regards, it both are still used. But I think as we've seen Taiwan move into democracy, the Taiwanese needed to identify themselves. And I think they increasingly started to speak of themselves as Taiwanese. So it's been over the last 30 or 40 years that has been a progressive change. In 1978, it was Melida, which is Formosa magazine. And since then, it's been mostly a reference to Taiwanese. Yes? That was, I think it was Han Suyin. She was a mainland Chinese writer, probably writing about the 20s. It might have been set in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has had a vibrant movie. Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember the story that much. Okay. I'm too young. Yep. Hong Kong had a really big movie industry. Yes.
It's problem has been going on for so long.
Jinmen and Matsu. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we think about Taiwan, we think about the big island of Taiwan, but there are actually three other island groups. One's the Pescadores, which is slightly southeast of Taiwan, and then there's Jinmen and Matsu, which are within artillery range of the mainland. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, the PRC forces and the ROC forces would regularly shoot back and forth at each other from those two islands. And in 1957, 58, there was one of the periodic crises, as they call them, where somebody started shelling somebody else. By the 1970s, this had played out to the point where, okay, we're going to shell you Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You're going to shell us Tuesday, Thursday, and we're going to take the weekend off. And it had become a little bit ritualistic. But earlier it was a flashpoint because there was always the fear, because of the proximity to the China coast, literally right on the coast, that the Chinese mainland PRC forces would invade and take them over. Thank you very much for braving the weather and coming out. Thank you.